Happy to introduce Matt Vasquez. He's the district wildlife biologist with the Gunnison Ranger District in Delta, and that's part of the Grand Mesa, Uncompahgre, Gunnison National Forests. And Matt's been working on wet meadow restoration for improving habitat for the Gunnison sage grouse and migratory birds and other wildlife. And so Matt, if you'd like to take it from there, that'd be great.
All right.
Thanks for
Well,
joining us. Yeah.
thank you for having me. I sure appreciate the opportunity to share with you what we've been doing and what we're learning. So I'm gonna turn my video off. I've found that
Okay.
in the virtual world and doing a lot of video conferences, when I do presentations, I tend to distract myself by being able to see myself. So
Okay.
I'll turn my video off
Okay.
here, then I'll share my screen.
Okay.
All right. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes. Looks
Okay.
good.
All right. So, yeah, I'm going to talk with you today about wet meadow habitat restoration that we've been doing in the Gunnison Basin and more specifically the upper Gunnison Basin. And so the area around Gunnison here on public and private lands. And this is a partnership with the Gunnison Climate Working Group. And so on behalf of the Gunnison Climate Working Group, thank you for the opportunity to tell our story and share what we've learned. With me being with the Forest Service, and we work with state and federal land managers as well, and so for the Forest Service, we manage for multiple uses, and often the multiple uses conflict with each other, and certainly can conflict with wildlife needs as well. And now we have climate change, of course, and everything associated with that, including drought, increased drought frequency, longer wildfire season, and more frequent fires, and rising temperatures, and all these things really drive ecological changes out in the landscape. And so that's a big challenge, a big management challenge for us. And so the question that we've asked is, in light of those challenges, how do we make these ecosystems that we're fortunate to get to help steward more resilient to these impacts and these changes that are occurring out there? And so, with all these changes that are occurring, and like I mentioned, we're seeing more frequent droughts, wildfires, and longer fire seasons, more invasive species, species like cheatgrass moving in, and just these weather extremes that contribute to rapidly changing conditions, and that affects the natural resources out there and people as well. And so here in Southwest Colorado, we're really focused on looking at climate adaptation, keying in on how can we make things more resilient to drought, and especially thinking about the importance of water on the landscape and how do we maintain water out there. One of those majorly important ecosystem services that we all depend on. And so this evening, what I'll cover is how we formed as a partnership and how we got started, examples of restoration needs, why restore wet meadows and what's at risk, what our restoration goals are. I'll talk about the restoration methods and techniques and show some specific examples that we've been doing. I'll talk about the process of selecting sites for restoration and what we do to prepare them and then implement them. I'll share some monitoring results as well, and then I'll share successes and lessons learned. And so on this first slide here, you see a picture of the federally threatened Gunnison sage grouse. And here in the Gunnison community, as well as other communities that are within the range of the species here in Western Colorado, there's been a lot of great efforts going on to try to conserve these species, and the wet meadow restoration that we're doing is one of those efforts. And so what you see in this picture is a bunch of Gunnison sage grouse that were photographed from a trail cam, a remote camera that Colorado Parks and Wildlife had put up at one of our restoration sites. And what you see here is birds that are foraging. They're eating insects and they're eating plants, forbs. You know, these really succulent type of plants out there that are in these little meadow habitats that you see here. And so just keep this in mind. Keep this picture, this visualization in your mind as we go through the presentation. First, I just want to quickly acknowledge all of our partners that make this possible. And as you can see here, we have a lot of partners that have been involved with this project for about 8 years now. So we work with federal and state land management agencies, as well as nonprofit organizations and private landowners as well. And I'll just set the stage for you for this landscape that I'll be talking about. And perhaps many of you are familiar with it. Maybe you've recreated out here and spent time out here. The Gunnison Basin is certainly an amazing place, and so the area that we're talking about here is, you know, here you can see if you can see my cursor, you can see the Gunnison Basin in red, and then that east half of it is the upper Gunnison Basin, where all of our work, or a majority of our work, is taking place. And so we're working within a 2.5 million acre landscape, of which 85% of it is public lands managed by the Forest Service, the BLM, National Park Service, the state, Colorado Parks and Wildlife. And it's a landscape with about 23,000 people across 3 counties. So that's Gunnison, Hinsdale, and Saguache counties. It's a high elevation basin with irrigated hay meadows, cottonwood, riparian habitats, a lot of sagebrush, aspen forest, mixed conifer and montane forest, subalpine forests, and alpine ecosystems. So pretty diverse. And so how did we get started with doing this wet meadow restoration work here in Gunnison? Well, going back to December of 2009, the Nature Conservancy convened a climate adaptation workshop for natural resource managers in the Gunnison Basin. And that kicked off the development of a climate change vulnerability assessment that they conducted here. And so the Gunnison Basin was selected for this climate change vulnerability assessment because of the diversity of ecosystems that we have here, strong partnerships here, the amount of public lands. We have the Gunnison River headwaters, and then we have imperiled species such as the Gunnison sage grouse. And so the Nature Conservancy developed a climate change vulnerability assessment of the ecosystems and species here, which was completed in 2011. And what they did was they analyzed the vulnerability to climate change of 24 ecosystems here, as well as the vulnerability of 74 species as well. And what they were doing was seeking to answer the questions of, what species and ecosystems are at risk, and how vulnerable are they, and what attributes make them vulnerable. So as a result of the initial 2009 climate adaptation workshop that the Nature Conservancy convened, partners said that they wanted to continue that dialogue. And so the Nature Conservancy helped establish the Gunnison Climate Working Group to implement the workshop recommendations and develop a climate adaptation project in Gunnison. And so to develop a climate adaptation project in Gunnison, we first had to pick, what ecosystem we want to work in. What ecosystem might be most vulnerable, and what makes it vulnerable, and what species within it are really vulnerable that we care about. And so, this led to selecting the sagebrush ecosystem and Gunnison sage grouse for implementing wet meadow and riparian erosion control restoration work. And so, Gunnison sage grouse and the wet meadow habitats that they depend on were identified as highly vulnerable. And so we identified multiple outcomes in addition to thinking about how can we make these wet meadows within the sagebrush ecosystem more resilient to things like drought. Um, are there other species that will benefit and other ecosystem services that that wildlife and people depend on? And as you probably all know, here in the Gunnison area, as well as in many communities and places in western Colorado, agriculture and ranching are important livelihoods. Those land-based livelihoods that depend on these ecosystem services. And so this slide just shows an example of that. And so we have the Gunnison sage grouse over here on the upper left here. We have a male displaying on a breeding site called a lek. We have a female sage grouse here next to him. And then this picture on the right, top right, is a really good example of the wet meadow habitats that we're working in within the sagebrush ecosystem around Gunnison. And then down at the bottom, we just have an array of other things that depend on these wet meadow habitats. So we have a variety of neotropical migratory birds, amphibians like tiger salamanders here in that second bottom picture there. We have elk that certainly use these habitats as well. And here we have another trail cam that CPW had set up at a restored site, capturing photographs of cow, elk, and calves here. And then those land-based livelihoods, so our ranching community. And so, these wet meadow habitats within the sagebrush ecosystem are certainly highly vulnerable, as these pictures can demonstrate here. And so if you, let's see here, give me 1 second. I might try to use the pointer feature. Okay, so if you look here, you see this gully that's in the middle of this meadow habitat surrounded by sagebrush here. And so that's gully erosion that began and is drying out this meadow, and we're losing this meadow here. And the picture beneath it is a close-up of that. And then you see things like over here where we've got erosion starting. We call this a head cut. And what's happening here, we're losing soil. When this erosion starts, it exposes the roots of the vegetation. That kills the plants, and so we lose plant cover as well. And eventually this will continue to migrate upslope, and we'll lose the entirety of this meadow. Roads are often a big contributor to erosion, where they catch water and drain water and create a gully where a gully would not otherwise exist. And when you think about it, it's really hard to find a place out in the landscape anywhere where water and hydrology is not influenced by a road or a trail. And then again, here you see this we call bank trampling, where you have livestock or wildlife such as elk that spend time here. They concentrate here because that's where the water is, that's where the best food is, and you end up getting this bank trampling and erosion that starts from that as well. And here's an example of wet meadow habitat that we've been working to restore since 2013 on Forest Service lands. This is on Flat Top Mountain, just north of Gunnison. And so what we key in on in these landscapes is these meadow habitats here within them. Essentially what we're trying to do is remodel these wet habitats. We refer to them as mesic habitats by implementing simple yet effective restoration techniques that increases their resiliency to drought, heavy runoff events. At the same time, we're thinking about other management activities and influencing factors on the landscape that might increase the vulnerability of this habitat. Precipitation is definitely another important factor, and it can be highly variable in the semi-arid climate of the Gunnison Basin, as well as throughout the range of the Gunnison sage grouse. And just as an example of that, in 2018, we experienced a pretty bad drought, pretty intense drought. And then in 2019, we had a really heavy winter, really heavy snow. And then this year, another drought, pretty dry conditions out there this year as well. And so here's an example of climate change impacts and strategic actions that the Gunnison Climate Working Group decided to focus on. And when you look at what we're doing here, these strategies, they're not always innovative or new. They're often part of what land managers are already doing, but perhaps need some adjusting and more coordination and leveraging of resources and prioritization to accelerate actions that address threats to species. And so one of the things that the Gunnison Climate Working Group reached consensus on was that, this work is just not occurring fast enough, considering the climate change impacts that we're seeing. However, we were encouraged that management actions have the potential to be retooled or reframed to address these issues more effectively. And so our priority adaptation strategy, we really decided to focus on those Gunnison sage grouse broodering habitats, and that's really those wet meadow habitats. So if you think back to the very first slide of those sage grouse in a meadow, those are what we consider broodering habitats, where sage grouse hens will take their chicks to find the protein, the insects that they really need, as well as those forb plants that they eat as well during the spring and summer. And so, what we're seeing is from the erosion, we're in climate change impacts, we're seeing reduced amount of that habitat that sage grouse depend on, and where we have it, it's lower quality, and that translates to less food, less plants and insects that the grouse depend on. We expect to see sage grouse shift to higher elevations over time, and lower chick survival as well. And so, again, thinking back to that very first slide where you saw those sage grouse in that meadow, they're picking the forbs to eat. They're eating a lot of insects in there, and for the chicks in particular, the first 2 months of their lives, they really need that protein. They really need insects to survive. If they're not getting that protein, they're not going to survive. And that's what we feel is one of the big bottlenecks for the Gunnison sage grouse is that chick survival. And so if their habitat that harbors the most insects and the forbs that they depend on is being affected and being reduced and lower quality, then that means most likely we're going to have lower chick survival out there. So our strategy is to see what we can do to try to retain water in these vulnerable habitats. And so, we're looking to restore areas where we have seeps and springs and these wet meadow habitats that they're using. We're working to reduce erosion through a variety of techniques that I'll show in a few minutes here. And by doing that will raise water tables and then spread water out, return that sheet flow across these meadow habitats again. And then that will increase the plant cover as well. And that translates to better habitat for insects, and increased food for sage grouse, in particular the chicks that depend on that. And so what we're striving to do is make poor quality habitats, eroded habitats that look like this on the left, and turn those into what you see over here on the right. So, and again, if you think back to that first slide of sage grouse foraging in that meadow, that buffet of insects and forbs, this is why restoring those wet meadow habitats matter for Gunnison sage grouse. And so again, for the first 2 months of their lives, those chicks are eating arthropods, which are typically crawling insects like beetles and spiders and ants. And these wet meadow habitats are good habitat for this high protein diet, which those chicks must have to survive. So by maintaining and restoring and enhancing these meadow habitats, that may contribute to higher chick survival rates and population recruitment for the Gunnison sage grouse. And these areas are also important for ranchers and our grazing permittees as well. They're used by livestock for forage and water. And collectively, this is in alignment with the multiple use mission of the Forest Service. There's a very direct and clear connection to restoration of wet meadow habitats and the Gunnison sage grouse. And however, our goal isn't just Gunnison sage grouse centric, but we're also looking to integrate with other wildlife, ecosystem services, and people as well. And I'll just read our project vision, which describes the desired condition that we're working towards by doing this restoration. Natural wet meadows and riparian habitats within the sagebrush ecosystem of the Upper Gunnison Basin are resilient and support a sustaining population of the Gunnison sage grouse and other species, biological communities, ecosystem services, and livelihoods in the face of a changing climate. Sustained and long-term community commitment to stewardship of wet meadows and riparian areas helps nature and people adapt to a changing climate. So that's our vision that we stay focused on, that we're working towards. And you've heard me say the word resilience repeatedly, and I'll continue to say that throughout this presentation. And what we mean by resilience is the capacity of a system to absorb impacts without changing, or the ability of that system to recover from stresses or disturbances. And so, how do we keep these high quality wet meadow habitats like you see here? How do we keep them that way, even when we have drought periods? That's what we're striving for. So this kind of paints that picture of where we're working around Gunnison. And so we initially established 4 priority sites going back to 2012 when we first began this work. And so one area is called Gunnison Basin, which is south of Blue Mesa Reservoir. Another is called Wolf Creek, which is on private land. And then Gunnison Basin is on BLM land primarily, but also includes some private land. Wolf Creek is private land surrounded by BLM, also south of Blue Mesa Reservoir. We have the Flat Top Mountain area, which is Forest Service lands north of Gunnison, up to Ohio Creek Valley area. And for us, for the Forest Service, this really is our most important area of Gunnison sage grouse habitat on national forest lands. It's where we have our biggest area of contiguous high quality sagebrush habitat, and where we have the most birds, concentrated use of sage grouse on national forest system lands. And then Chance Gulch, which is just southeast of Gunnison, BLM lands, as well as some state managed lands too. And then we have a variety of other sites that we've been working and continue to work in since 2012 as well. And the way that we selected these sites for doing wet meadow restoration work, it involved a variety of things, but we worked to filter sites based on what we thought was the most important for the Gunnison sage grouse, and in particular for sage grouse chick survival. We looked at proximity of sites to leks, which are our breeding grounds for Gunnison sage grouse. We looked at what the restoration need is as well. And then, where we're looking for opportunities to work on private lands as well, finding willing landowners that were willing to work with us too. And so in 2012, we first selected 2 sites on private lands as demonstration sites. And in the meantime, while that work began on the private lands, the BLM and the Forest Service, we began our work to meet all of the regulatory requirements that we have before we can actually do things on the ground. So meeting our requirements under NEPA, um, our requirements for protecting cultural resources, compliance with the Endangered Species Act and the Clean Water Act, all those regulatory requirements that we're responsible for ensuring compliance with. We went through our process of doing that before we could begin work on public lands. And then in 2013, that's when we began work on public lands too. And so, really we take a holistic approach, and we're working across both public and private lands. We don't see fences or boundaries. We just look for opportunities and folks that are willing to work together on this. And so, what we're doing out there, it involves really simple, elemental, yet effective, highly effective techniques. And so we do a variety of different techniques that we apply. Most of the work that we do involves working with rock by hand and building a variety of rock structures depending on the type of erosion that we're dealing with. And so we have a variety of names that they're called that I'll go through in a minute here. We also build structures out of logs, and I'll show some examples of that as well. We do things like we'll build drift fences to influence livestock behavior on the landscape. So try to change, their patterns out there, how they distribute themselves across the landscape. And I'll show an example of that as well. And then we do, on occasion, we'll use heavy equipment and do some earthwork to restore wet meadows too. And I'll show you some examples of that. And all these techniques that we apply come from this book called Let the Water Do the Work by Bill Zedike and Van Clothier. And so this is a cross section of profile here of what we deal with out there. And so typically, if you have a healthy functioning slope wetland, you expect something like what you see here at the top, where you don't have a big gully. You might have multiple shallow channels and really good dispersed water flow across the ground. And you'll have a water table as well. And so you end up with a bigger wetland habitat or bigger wet meadow there. It's like a sponge out in the sagebrush ecosystem. And then, something happens where you start to get either some erosion or a confined channel, and you get more concentrated flow of water. And then what these arrows symbolize is the lowering of that water table as this starts to happen. And then as you get more down cutting, more erosion, that water table continues to lower until you really have a deep incised channel here and a really low water table. And then you've lost all this wet meadow habitat that once existed, like at the top of this diagram here. And so, the reason we're concerned about this is because the loss of that natural water storage capacity, we live in a low precipitation area. And so losing that water storage capacity where we already have low precipitation is certainly a concern. And these wet areas represent a really small fraction of the overall landscape, but they're disproportionately important to many things out there. And so we certainly want to do what we can to maintain these. So here's an example of a structure that was built with a single layer of rock on the bed of a channel. And so this is called a one rock dam. And this is our most common structure that we build. And so it's called a one rock dam because it's only one rock high, as you can see here. And what this is meant to do is really slow the energy of the water down, catch sediments like you see right here. And then once you start catching sediments, you get more vegetation that grows in the rocks as well. Those plants will catch even more sediments. You'll really infiltrate the stream banks with water and just re-wet that natural sponge out there and increase that wet meadow habitat. Here's another example of a one rock dam here on the left. And so what we have here is erosion beginning on a meadow, and you can start to see this down cut here, um, like we kind of saw in that example, that cross section diagram a few slides before this. And so we built a one rock dam here, just using local native rock that was available on site here, and try to stop that down cutting. Then if you look up above it here, you see some more erosion occurring, and then this picture on the right is a close up of that, where we had erosion in the meadow here. And if we just left it alone, it would have continued to erode, and we would have continued to lose soil and vegetation in this meadow. This would have migrated up the meadow. And again, these meadow habitats are just so important for the Gunnison sage grouse and many other species, as well as for livestock forage too. Newer techniques that we've tried more recently here are beaver dam analogs. And so this was at a state wildlife area just south of the flat top area that we were looking at earlier, north of Gunnison. And so this is at the Miller Ranch State Wildlife Area managed by Colorado Parks and Wildlife. And this is a perennial stream. And so again, this is a real simple but highly effective technique where you're simulating beavers basically. And so you drive in these wood stakes in the ground, and you take willow, you cut some willow, and you weave willow through these. And while you do that, while you add more layers of willow, you pack it down as tight as you can. You just keep adding more layers. And it really simulates what a beaver would do here. So very, very highly effective technique. Here, this is a structure called a media luna. And what this is designed to do is to restore sheet flow across a meadow here. And so by building this structure with this angle, essentially like a half moon type of shape, we use a laser level. We make sure this is level, completely level across the top here. And by doing that, it catches that water and spreads it out pretty effectively. And so here on the right, this is an example of that, where the top photo was taken in the fall of 2012 as these folks were building this media luna structure here. And you can see this meadow is pretty degraded as well. And then this bottom photo is 1 year later, and you can see how much it restored. And so this is a very highly effective structure here for spreading water back out over a meadow again. This is called a Zuni bowl. And so this is a structure that we build to stop a big head cut. And so, here we had a big head cut structure that would have continued to migrate up this gully and would have continued to dry out this meadow here with this concentrated flow that you see in this gully. And so what this does is you create a plunge pool that really just kind of slows the water down and stops it. And then you have another structure, the one rock dam structure beneath it, that continues to slow that energy down and kind of pull up the water there. And so it stops that head cutting that would otherwise migrate up this gully here. This is an example of earthwork. So using a dozer to create what's called a plug and spread structure. And this is highly effective to restore acres of wet meadow habitat really quickly. And so what you do is you typically you have a gully through a meadow where a gully should not exist. And so you plug it up, you plug that gully up there, you starve it of water so it stops the erosion. And then you create these bays. And so this is a double bay, a plug and spread structure. And then that'll collect water and then spread it back out over this meadow. So we're not creating ponds, we're not impounding water. It's just catching it and slowly releasing it again back over the meadow to restore that wet meadow habitat. Here's another example of that work occurring on private land adjacent to national forest land. And it looks pretty destructive. I mean, we're doing earthwork out there. And so we have to be very thoughtful in how we do it. We have to be very careful that we're not bringing in non-native plants like cheatgrass. And this is an example of that same site that you saw on the previous slide, but looking from above it and looking down. And so this fence line here is the private and national forest boundary. And so this is the plug and spread structures that were built on the private land that you saw on the previous slide, now holding water and spreading water out. And then we did some similar work above it on Forest Service lands as well.
The cows.
Yeah, and so we have cows in there. And that's a good, I'll just comment about that. We certainly, try to work hard with our grazing permittees on how we manage the livestock grazing out there, because, we are making these sites wetter, and of course, water attracts cows. And if you get that concentrated livestock use in these areas, well, that creates more impacts, and that can reverse, the restoration work that we're doing. So we certainly work very closely with our grazing permittees on managing the grazing out there. For example, at this site, normally our grazing permittee would string up electric fence that would prevent access to this part of this pasture that the cows graze in, and keep them out of this area here. And so that's just one way that we do it. These these plug and spread structures do not hold water for very long. They might hold water for a few days during the wettest part of the year, which for us is during the spring when we get peak runoff, snow melt. And that's usually when they're collecting water for a few days and then spreading it back out over these meadows. This is a close-up of that same spot where the cows were on the National Forest land. And so here we have a bay that collected water that otherwise would have gone through the gully. And then here it's spreading it out over a meadow, and you can see the sheet flow happening out here. And then you have sagebrush that died off because it's too wet. So, there's certainly a lot of things that contribute to these erosion the erosion that we see out there. And what we do is we work to identify what those problems are. We learn how to read the landscape. We learn how water moves through it, and we learn how to identify the causes of erosion. And understanding the cause, it enables us to figure out the best way to fix it. And so in these pictures here, you can see a variety of problems. Here we have, looks like bank trampling here impacting this meadow, which will dry it out. Here you have a pretty deep incised gully as well. And again, that just, when it's flowing, the water moves through it really quickly. The water is concentrated right here in the steep gully, and it's not re-wetting this meadow habitat around it. And so this person here is Bill Zedike, and you see him in each of these photos. And so Bill has really been our mentor. He first came to the Gunnison Basin in 2010, and he's the one that we've been learning these restoration techniques from. He developed a lot of these techniques. It's something that he's been doing for more than 20 years now. And it's been a second career for him. So he once worked for the Forest Service, did a full career with the Forest Service, and then retired, I think, in the late 80s or early 90s. And then did this whole other career with restoration, wet meadow restoration. And so he truly is our mentor, and has taught us, how to read the landscape, how to identify the problems out there, how to learn how the water moves through the landscape. And by keying in on those things, then we can figure out, what's the best way to fix it. And, there's a lot that goes into doing this work. And so, first we have to design our treatments and mark them on the ground. We have to get an archaeologist out there to make sure that we're not going to impact any cultural resources or artifacts. And so this person here that's Justin Lawrence. He's our archaeologist. And he found a hunting blind, prehistoric hunting blind right here, that was within one of our wet meadow restoration sites. And so we avoided this site here. You know, we stake where we're going to build structures. We identify what kind of structure it is. So ORD stands for one rock dam. And this 4x5 by 0.5, those are the dimensions of it as well. And we use that to help us estimate how much rock we need to haul out here and stage to build these structures. We often use blue paint to mark the outline of where the structure should go on the ground. And here you can see Bill Zedek doing that. And this is what, you know, our planning looks like on a map. And so, you know, here we've identified where the wet meadow habitats are in blue, and where the streams are, the blue lines. The little dots here, these little green dots, are where we identified rock structures, restoration structures to be built. And then we have to identify where we're going to stage rock and how much is needed. And so this is just one example of kind of detailing that out as part of our planning. And then we have to get the rock and the materials, the logs, everything to these sites, which it's not easy. It's pretty labor intensive. But we have a variety of tools to help us to do that. And so the top photo here, we had a mule pack string, a Forest Service mule pack string that helped haul rock to the remote sites that we could not have otherwise done restoration work if it wasn't for having mules available to haul rock for us. And during a 7-day period in August and September of 2018, this mule pack string hauled about 30,000 pounds of rock to a couple of remote sites for us. And then, you know, we use a variety of ATVs and UTVs to get rock moved around as well. Here you see Betsy Neely, who's retired from the Nature Conservancy, but she was an instrumental person in getting all this work started here. And here we have a youth crew. So this is a Western Colorado Conservation Corps crew hauling a log for a log structure that I'll show in a minute. We do a lot of training. And so we work with a lot of volunteers and youth crews like Youth Conservation Corps, Western Colorado Conservation Corps. We partner with the Wildlands Restoration Volunteers, which is a group out of Boulder on the Front Range, and they recruit a lot of volunteers for us. More recently, we've partnered with High Country Conservation Advocates out of Crested Butte, likewise, that help recruit volunteers from the local community to come out and help us do this work. And so, you know, training crews, youth crews, and volunteers, it's such an important investment. And that's what it takes to get long-term sustainability and build our capacity to do this work and increase our restoration. And we do a lot of monitoring, you know, so is the project working? Are we making progress towards meeting our objectives? And so we've established 217 transects, which is what you see right here, just an example of that, as well as 500 photo points. And what you see here is we have a transect here where these individuals are measuring plant heights and plant cover and species composition, and trying to document, you know, are we meeting or moving towards our objectives to increase the cover and density of plants while decreasing the cover of upland species. So we're trying to increase more of those wetland species out there. And here, I really like this comparison, because what you see is, you see this individual, this is Gay Austin. She's a retired BLM ecologist. So you see where this line is drawn just above her hip here. And then you look over here to the right, and you see where that same line is on her, and you see how much this has collected soils and new vegetation and is really starting to fill in here. And so what we do is we work hard to repeat our monitoring and the photos at approximately the same time every year, so that we can do these comparisons. And we keep the same people, we position them in the same place. And this is a really cool example of seeing how we're raising this stream bed here with the restoration. And so there's a lot going on here in this graph, but you know, what matters here is that, you know, here you see this bottom line. These are control sites, so places where we're not doing restoration. And we're collecting vegetation data, like you saw in that previous photo, at sites where we're not doing restoration, and we're comparing them to sites where we are doing restoration. And so what you see is a statistically significant um, increase in wetland species cover where we're doing restoration compared to where we're not. I think it's about a 62% increase at restoration sites compared to untreated sites. So it's working. And again, here's more monitoring, where we had a pretty major head cut at one of our Forest Service sites. And in here we had a Nature Conservancy crew, a fire crew, that did this work. Here they built a log and fabric structure to stop this head cut. And so this was done in 2013. The top two photos you see are 2013. This bottom left photo was a year later. And you can see where we've increased in sediments in 1 year's time here compared to when we first started it. And then you could move over to 2019, and it's really filled in. This was a gully that we had no expectation that we would fill this gully in. We simply thought we would stop the head cut from migrating up and losing more of this meadow. But it's really filling in, and we've been really amazed by it. Earlier, I mentioned the drift fences as one technique that we apply also to try to influence livestock behavior out in the landscape. And so here we have a wet meadow habitat here where we've got livestock that have been trailing to it for a long time and having an impact to it. And so one of our goals is to try to do things that pushes the livestock more in the upland habitats and out of these more sensitive wet areas. And so we built a couple of drift fences that go perpendicular to where the livestock were trailing through here. And that's just enough to influence their behavior, where it shifted them up in the upland to get around this fence. And so this was 1 year's time, and we were just amazed at the increase of growth that we've seen here. Now, it's varied from year to year. Of course, it depends on how much precipitation you're getting each year, but certainly this is highly effective in terms of influencing livestock and where they trail on the landscape and their distribution out there. And so we made a lot of progress since 2012. And so since 2012, we've done restoration work in about 24 stream miles. We've built over 1,900 structures, most of those rock structures. We've estimated that that's benefiting about 1,200 acres of habitat. We've worked with and trained hundreds of volunteers and youth crews and students as well. And if you're interested, you can Google this book here, this technical note by the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And so many of our partners on this project are co-authors on this technical note that describes these practices in much greater detail. And we've been sharing what we're learning as well, and working to scale up this work and do more of it and make it more sustainable to keep doing this work. And so to do that, you know, funding sources are highly important. Continuing to train folks to do this work, train volunteers, recruit volunteers, and youth crews and students. You know, that's how we scale this work up. And we continue to learn. We've learned a lot from this work over the years, and no doubt we're going to keep learning more too. And so, you know, with climate change, there's certainly some things that are just out of our control to a certain extent. And so it's important to embrace change and manage for future conditions. You know, think about how things might be influenced in the future, and what does that mean, and how do we manage that. The partnerships and collaboration, you know, that's why this is successful, and that's the only way that this kind of work can be successful. It's important to build that local capacity and people that are champions for this work. And we need to build a sustainable and enduring program. And again, that gets to, you know, continuing to recruit folks um, to do this work, to learn these techniques, find long-term sustainable funding sources to keep this work going. We ensure scientific rigor and monitoring. That's so critical to understand, you know, are we meeting our objectives that we set out for? And if not, why is that? And what do we need to change? And we continue to learn and adjust as practitioners as we continue to do this work. And again, you know, I just want to acknowledge all of our partners and supporters. You know, the driver that brought our partnership together is the Gunnison Sage Grouse and Gunnison Sage Grouse Conservation, and motivated people that care deeply about the bird and what it represents. You know, the sagebrush ecosystem, sagebrush dependent species, ecosystem services, and those land-based livelihoods. You know, we've convened around the common cause of restoring habitat for the Gunnison Sage Grouse. And since 2012, we've worked to improve wet meadows and these riparian areas and their resiliency to drought across multiple land ownerships, using funds, labor, and assistance from many sources. And that's raised awareness for the need to implement actions that increase ecosystem resiliency, but driven by a desire to help the Gunnison sage grouse and all it represents persist. And this is only possible by all these partners and the cooperating ranchers and landowners out there. And you know, our key partners on this have been the Nature Conservancy that really kicked this off and got this going. And now we work with the Upper Gunnison River Water Conservancy District that really serves as the coordinator amongst all the partners for this work. And then I just want to acknowledge Bill Zedike, who we've learned so much from, who's been our mentor on this. And that's all I've got. I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to share this with you and share what we've learned. I apologize. I think I went a lot longer than I had intended to. I was hoping for time for questions, but if you want to learn more, you know, feel free to reach out to me. Here's my contact information. Here's a couple of websites you can go to where there's information on this. And if there's time, I'd be happy to take questions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Matt. That was very interesting. I had no idea all this was going on. Um, so when you work on the rock projects, you know, to retain the water, do you also reseed with native plants, or do you just kind of let the ecosystem do what it's going to do afterward?
Yeah, great question. So for the most part, we have not reseeded. We've relied on the native seed bank that's present. Where we do reseed is if we're doing earthwork. So if we're using a dozer and if we're doing those plug and spread structures where we're
Yeah.
really disturbing the ground, then in that case, we do reseed. You know, we do worry about the vulnerability of that kind of disturbance to, and perhaps attracting non-native species like cheatgrass. So in those sites, we do seed with a native seed mix that is a good fit for the local area. And we'll do that as well. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
The other question I had was on one of your maps, it looked like these locations are close to four-wheel drive roads, which I guess, you know, would help to get to them. But
Mm-hmm.
are any of them actually close to hiking trails, or is that just something that you try to avoid, you know, because you don't want people messing with, you know, the bird habitat or whatever?
Yeah. So for the sites on Forest Service lands, and I think this is probably true for the majority of sites on BLM lands and other places as well where we're doing this work, there really aren't any trails, any recreation trails. And I think I think mainly that's because of just the location and the landscape where these are. They're not typically in places where there's a lot of recreation going on, a lot of trails. And so typically we do have those roads that you saw, those 2-track roads that are out there that often are the contributors to this erosion that we're addressing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That makes sense. Okay.
Mhm. Yeah. So, you know, if anyone from your organization would be interested in getting involved, you know, please feel free to reach out to me. We have a wet meadow restoration coordinator who's on contract with the Upper Gunnison River Water Conservancy District, and he really spearheads the coordination amongst all the partners on this work. And we're always looking to recruit volunteers and other organizations that would like to be part of this to get out and get involved and help us with this. So if there's interest, you know, please let me know. We'd
Okay.
love to work with you.
Is it something that's feasible for like a one-day project, or does it need to be a multi-day project?
Absolutely. You know, 1-day projects, very feasible, and we've done that often. Sometimes we'll organize like single volunteer days
Okay.
with groups, and that works really well.
Okay.
Yep.
Could be. That
Um,
could be
yeah.
possibility. Yeah.
Yeah, and we've done both. We've done single days, multiple days as
Hmm.
well, and sometimes if we have multi-day events, you know, folks will kind of come and go, you know, as they can throughout that time and not stay the
Right.
entire time, which is fine as well. So yeah, there's a lot of options, flexibility to get involved. You know, whatever works best for people when we
Okay.
have the opportunities.
Okay.
Yep.
Sounds good. Does anybody else have questions?
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to share this
Yeah.
with you.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was very interesting. I really enjoyed about it. And I find it interesting that you all started back in 2009 or so. Is that what you said initially with the um, Conservation Society?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so 2009 is when the Gunnison Climate Working Group really got started
Yeah.
and started convening, and then it was 2012 when we first started implementing this restoration work on the ground. But
Okay.
you know, there was some planning and coordinating leading up to that. Um, but yeah, it was 2009 and the Nature Conservancy that convened us that led to this work.
Okay.
Yep.
Great.
Mhm. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Matt. Really appreciate it. And if anybody else has any questions, speak up.
Well, thank you, Matt.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Thank you. Again,
Appreciate
I
it.
appreciate it.
Yeah.
And yeah, don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have any questions or if you'd like to get involved.
Okay.
Right.
Excellent. Thanks. Thanks so much.
All
Appreciate
right.
it.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks,
All
everybody.
right.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.